Hello class, welcome to our recorded session for our check-in. Alright, just a reminder about course flow. There's the various activities that you should be doing as we go through this course. Reading the textbook chapters, completing chapter quiz homework assignments as well. Printing out the lectures so they can be annotated as you view video lectures and discuss particular topics. View the course videos as well, such as Crash Course in School of Life. So let's start off with one of the key things that kicked off this particular unit. Starting off with chapter 4, Descartes and the mind-body problem. Let's go over some of the key concepts and ideas. It began with a discussion about what the mind actually is. And the idea is that we really don't know for sure as to what it is. We know we experience it, but our experience is a very personal thing. It's very subjective. So how do we know if we are experiencing the same thing as another person, for example? There's no real way for us to objectively find out. What are some of the theories of mind? Well, we talked about only the matter exists, or only mind exists, or both matter and mind exist, such as dualism, or neither matters, either matter or the mind. It's only about functionality. That how does the mind help us to function, for example? So looking at Descartes, the questions about Descartes basically comes down to him beginning to doubt what he knew for certain. He started to doubt his knowledge, what was true, what was real. So in beginning to doubt, he started to look for ways to find certainty, to be sure of something, to know that this thing is true. He also proposed ideas like innate ideas, meaning that when we are born with certain innate ideas already instilled in us. More about that a little bit later. But one of the things that he really started to question was what he was relying on previously as to how he understood the world is employing his senses. But he realized eventually that his senses sometimes provide him with untruths. We see something. We don't understand exactly what we heard. Our senses can sort of lie to us, not be as truthful as one would think. Therefore, he decided that our sensory data, when we get things from our senses, it must be validated first using rationality. So the idea is that we have these senses, but they are not really the truth. They're not necessarily the truth. We need to make sure or validate them in some way. So he came up with the idea of trying to get rid of all his knowledge, to take it out of the way, to chuck it, the whole list. All right. So he wanted to build back his knowledge with one thing, to start off with one thing that he could not doubt. And that's where his famous saying comes in, I think, therefore I am. So he wanted to find out and get some certainty that he himself, Rene, exists. Because he was doubting, he understood that he is a doubting or a thinking being. So in that instant, he came through logic, the notion that he indeed did exist as a thinking being. Not all the other stuff, okay, like a body and all that stuff. Not initially anyway. So that's what he came to realize, is that first sure certain thing about his existence. This was his certain knowledge. And as the story goes, he was able to build all the other knowledge bases back up as well. So he proposed this notion of dualism, that both the mind and the body exist separately, but interact in some way. Now, Descartes never resolved this mind-body problem. Okay, some even wonder, as we'll see in a second here, if it was even a problem at all. But by him coming up with these ideas, these notions in dualism, and his idea about what the mind is, he set the stage for a lot of discussion of philosophers and great thinkers that came after him. So, is there an issue of how items of different substances can interact? Let's review a few other ideas. We have property dualism, which is basically saying the mind and body are not two different substances. They're the same substance, but different properties, one physical and one non-physical. So that was one idea that sort of tries to address this mind-body problem, saying it's really not one. They're the same substance, just different properties. Then we have this notion of emergent properties, a higher order characteristic that is exhibited by a complex entity, but not exhibited by any of the individual parts. So it's almost like a Gestalt idea in a way. The property only comes into being when the parts combine with one another in certain specific ways. As the example here is, water is wet. It is a liquid and it has a certain color. But a molecule of water does not have these properties. So again, it's very Gestaltian idea is that when you combine these properties together, you get something totally different. And then we have the idea of a pseudo problem, an apparent problem that arises not because of any deep philosophical issue, but due to misunderstanding of concepts that are being discussed. For example, when you say understands or doubts, what do you specifically mean? So what they're suggesting here, it could be a language problem, okay, or a definition problem, for example. And then we have category mistake, erroneously treating an idea of one logical category as if it were a member of another logical category. So sort of like a mistake of understanding what you're communicating. For example, I may have shared with you in the recorded lecture previously for this topic, the notion that when I was visiting the schools, I was in a PhD program in Baton Rouge, LSU, and I wanted to switch schools. And so I did switch schools somewhat blind. I moved over to Richmond, Virginia to go to Virginia Commonwealth University. And I remember when I landed in Richmond, Virginia, I'm in the city now, and I asked somebody, where is VCU campus? And they just take their arms and sort of toss it up in the air like the whole city. And the idea here is that I made a category mistake in a way, thinking that a campus, a college campus, is one unified entity of a bunch of buildings located in a very, very specific area. But it can be also spread throughout a city. Okay, so you have buildings, houses, all this type of stuff throughout the city, and some of those buildings happen to be part of, quote, the campus. Now, also, when we look at Descartes, so we talked about his doubt and about some people whether or not those were some issues trying to come up with how the mind and body interact. He saw the universe as being made up of mechanical principles. So the mechanical principles as the rule of the universe is that there are a bunch of mechanisms in the universe. This was contrary to the view of Aristotle, which many years before came up with the idea of these special essences, somewhat mystical types of things, to explain why the universe worked the way it did. For example, why do rocks fall? Rocks fall from high places because the rocks want to go back to the other essences that are in the earth. That's where the rocks are. So he moved away from those notions, Rene Descartes did, in his view of the universe as being mechanistic. So here, looking at the contrary views of Aristotle as proposed by Rene here, mechanics explains most of the behavior of animals and humans. Mechanics, something that's very objective, something very physical. All are machines of greater or lesser complexity. So what he's communicating, again, is the idea that animals and humans are biological machines of greater or lesser complexity. So this, the difference between the animals and humans may be one simply of the complexity. We are more complex, for example. Now, he also wanted to make sure that we understood that humans have consciousness. Okay, we have minds. Okay, but animals do not possess this particular feature. All right, he is also equating consciousness / minds with souls. So the souls are just for us. We have the souls, the animals don't. They have these processes, these mechanics that may be very similar to how we respond and act to things, but they don't go to the full complexity of having a conscious mind. He also wanted to communicate that we have all these things which can be ruled by mechanics, but such things as consciousness and language, they come from the soul, not from the simple mechanics of life. So he helped to focus the study of consciousness. And again, we owe a lot to the early works of Descartes in formulating some of these ideas that psychologists, later philosophers, and later psychologists started to explore to a great degree. So he helped to sort of help the study of animals to become legitimized, because now we can learn at least some of the simple basic things from studying and analyzing how animals are put together, how they work. And also comparative psychology as well as cognitive psychology. Comparative psychology about comparing animals to humans, cognitive psychology about looking at those types of things, dealing with the thinking processes and factors such as that. So he excited interest in the mind and reality, as we'll see in the coming chapters. Now, what I mean by reality is this. One of the things that Descartes talked about is, how do you know if you're not dreaming right now? Okay, what is reality? Because basically, if you really think about it, when you are dreaming one of those, quote, realistic types of dreams, like a slice of your day or a slice of life, you don't know that you're really dreaming until you wake up. That's kind of a frightening thought, but the idea is there. So he excited interest in many of these ideas and concepts that we still talk about even today. So this sort of sets the stage up for John Locke that we talked about in chapter 5. Locke, Berkeley, and empiricism. So John Locke was an empiricist. Knowledge comes from experience. We would expect an empiricist to say that. We are also born a blank slate, or tabula rasa, according to John Locke as well. Before we experience stuff, we are blank. We have to get experiences before we can start putting stuff into our mind, so to speak. But he did see that there were certain types of things which he saw as being innate, meaning that we come into the world already possessing. He saw operations of the mind, so like the operating systems, in a way, are there. For example, the operations of the mind would be, for example, thinking or doubting or reflecting or remembering. So all those are operations of the mind, and he saw those types of things as being innate to human beings. But all the ideas come from sensory experience. And there are no innate ideas from his perspective, but there is innate operations. He also thought about ideas being simple or complex. He would say a simple idea is an idea that cannot be is indivisible. It cannot be broken down any further. It's the simplest idea. If you have a simple idea plus operations, thinking, analyzing, whatever you want to call it, combined together, simple ideas plus operations combined to form more complex ideas. Complex ideas which can obviously be broken down, because simple ideas come together to make up the complex ideas. So looking at where these ideas come from again, the notion is they must come from direct sensory stimulation or reflection of previous sensory stimulation. And that's what leads to ideas. These ideas can be acted upon by operations of the mind, leading to new ideas. All right? Now, as we stated earlier, Descartes got to a point where he was not looking at senses as a source of ultimate knowledge necessarily, but rationality only. But because the senses could not be fully trusted, you had to use rationale in order to test and to validate them. So to address issues, for example, Descartes' issue with senses, that we cannot trust them, John Locke came up with a new way to look at what is real, what isn't, okay? And he talked about primary qualities, which are ideas are a result of the actual physical attributes of objects in the real world. So there are certain types of qualities, I won't go into all the details here, there are certain types of qualities which are associated with the object itself in the real world. They belong to the object. And then he proposes that then there are secondary qualities, ideas which do not correspond to the object in the real world, which do not belong to the object, but belong to us, the ones who are perceiving the certain object. So the notion here is there are primary qualities that are real, legitimate things in the real physical world that belong to the object that we are sensing. And then the secondary qualities are the things that belong to us. As we look at this object, it's not part of the object, it's part of us. For example, one quick idea about the secondary qualities would be color. Okay, color is based on what we can see, what electromagnetic wavelengths that we have the ability to see, and that will determine the subjective experience that we have as the perceiver of the object in, quote, the real world. So we see that is what he did to try to address one of the issues that Descartes brought up as he came up and developed his ideas. I should note also that John Locke, as many of the philosophers during this time frame, were not just focused on philosophies that led to psychology, but on a whole host of ideas. John Locke was also very influential in areas of education as well as politics. So, the next individual is George Berkeley, or Berkeley. He disagreed with the views of Locke. He proposed esse is percepi, to be is to be perceived. We exist only in being perceived by another. So he disagreed with Locke on a couple of things, but also you can see here he disagrees to some extent with Descartes, it would seem. So he effectively was able to dismantle the argument of primary qualities, being independent of the observer. Because, as we know when we read in the textbook and reviewed the regular lecture, people can see these supposed real attributes differently too. Somebody could be looking at something which, like shape, which is supposed to be a real physical attribute, but depending on your perspectives, shape of something may change. So the perceivers are not perceiving the same thing which is supposed to be a primary quality, which should not be changing based on the individual. And I think in one of the videos that you're supposed to see as well, there's the idea of trying to think of an apple without a color. You can't do it. It can't happen. So what Berkeley was able to accomplish here is stating basically or allowing people to think it through to show that both primary and secondary qualities exist not in the material objects but in the minds of the perceivers as well. So what we have here, he basically dismantled the idea of what Locke proposed, that we have the primary qualities which belong to the real object itself, and the secondary qualities which are really our input into it. And so here, Berkeley is basically saying that same thing that you said is the secondary qualities also goes for the primary qualities as well. They're not people independent, that they are something too that is dependent upon the subject, the perceiver. So this led Berkeley to propose there is no such thing as a material world. Locke conceded that we do not see material objects but mental copies of them. And this is what we mean by the representative theory of perception, that these are just copies. So we don't see what's really there. We just have some form of representation of them in our mind. So Berkeley proposes what he calls sensible objects, which are real but not material. So here there's something that is real but does not have a physical form. It's not material, not corporeal. So these sensible objects, they are bundles of sensible qualities, and it exists if someone is perceiving them. So that saying again, SAS is percepi, to be is to be perceived, is sort of popping back there as well. So the bundles of sensible qualities exist if someone is perceiving them, because they are based on your senses. So existence per Berkeley is the following. 1. That which is perceived, a sensible, non-material object. And 2, that which perceives, the mind. Okay, so what this really is getting down to is the idea that we really don't have any bodies. Okay, we're just an idea in a sense. So looking at how Locke and Berkeley sort of have similarities and differences, let's do this real quick glance. The similarities. The importance of experience and learning as a source of knowledge, they agree to that. Ideas are the objects of our perception. Okay, that sounds cool. Locke, ideas are subjective effects caused by objective things. For Berkeley, the ideas are still there, but the ideas are the things themselves. And ultimately, the great difference between the individuals here, Berkeley, things do not exist independently of experience. Things do not exist independently of experience or of the perception. The perception makes it real. If you're not perceiving it, it's not real, it's not there, because it's about sensible objects. Locke basically thinks things do exist independent of experience. Then we go visit Hume and Kant and the idea of enlightenment. We'll start off with enlightenment, some key ideas and concepts there. It's really a major zeitgeist of the times, a spirit of the times, what was going on at this time. Enlightenment philosophers wanted to use the ideas and reason of scientific revolution, all the stuff we learned from the scientific revolution. They wanted to use those things for problems in government and society. Government society. So we learned some things during the scientific revolution. We want to try to use those skills and that knowledge that we've gained to improve government and society. It was a period of intentional antagonism toward the authorities they challenged. So those people who were Enlightenment philosophers and Enlightenment proponents, they were sort of putting all this new ways of looking at things in the face of the authority, the face of the status quo. So they were fighting against things like dogma, where you have these strict rules you are to adhere to specifically. They fought against things like superstition, the medieval notions of gods and demons. They fought against traditional religion, questioning the historical accuracy of the Bible and certain concepts within the Bible. So it wasn't always about saying they were anti-God or anything like that, but not always taking this stuff at face value. They weren't doing this time for people to think for themselves. And then we look at also the divine right of kings, whether or not rule should be by the people for the people. So these were things which were some crazy and wild ideas during the Enlightenment period. But it was a time of people being very contrary and to a great deal of traditional ways in which things have been done for centuries up until this point. And also, this impact of the Enlightenment, we see it even to this day. The United States was founded on the principles of the Enlightenment, with its Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and about how our government was set up to be for the people, by the people, those types of ideas. Now, let's look a little bit more closely now at Hume. Hume was around this time of the Enlightenment. He wanted to debunk superstitions of the day. He wanted us to get past those medieval ideas and notions of demonology and angelology and all that type of stuff. He was inspired by Newton's work, and he wanted to do what Newton did for the physical world. He wanted to do that for understanding humans. So we must form principles of human nature from the data. From the data, and what he means by that, from perceptions. All the contents of our minds, when we are awake and alert, according to Hume, is all our ideas, all the ideas of sciences, all the arbitrary and superstitious ideas as well. So that was the thing that interested him. Hume, was aiming to draw a line between legitimate and illegitimate ideas to uncover the origins of our ideas. For Hume, ideas are merely faint images or copies of more vivid experiences, perceptions of the senses, and emotional states. The difference in liveliness, or what we refer to as vivacity, is the real difference between the weaker states of mind, we call ideas, and other perceptions of mind, which Hume proposes to call impressions. So let's look a little bit more closely at these two ideas. So we have Hume's theory of ideas. We have perceptions can be divided into impressions and ideas. Impressions enter the mind with the most force and violence, sensations, passions, and emotions. Ideas are the faint images of impressions and thinking and reasoning. Here's an example. If you slap the table with your hand, the sound you hear is an impression. Think of it as if it's an impression upon your sensory receptors. Slap at the table with your hand, you hear an impression. And your recollection of that sound is the idea. Again, the idea, the faint image of an impression, and thinking and reasoning and remembering could be added there as well. So we have these simple and complex perceptions. He distinguished between these two things, with simple perceptions being single, solitary ideas, complex perceptions built out of simple perceptions. So again, we've seen this idea a couple of times already, where we have the simple stuff added together, combined in some fashion or form to make something more complicated or complex. So looking at ideas and impressions. For Hume, it seems that all the perceptions of the mind are double and appear both as impressions when they first impressed upon you and ideas as you reflect upon them. But Hume notices that this isn't correct, for you can have an idea that doesn't correspond to any impression. So let me make sure I read that correctly. But Hume notices that this isn't correct, for you can have an idea that doesn't correspond to any impression. But Hume notes that such cases are only cases of complex ideas. So what they're basically saying, for every simple perception, our perceptions are always double. Every simple idea corresponds to a simple impression that resembles it. So the origin of all our ideas, because remember, complex ideas are made of simple ideas too. The origin of all our ideas are impressions. That we must have that impression first before we can have an idea about it. Without an impression, there is no idea. And this is a rule with devastating consequences regarding the self and causation. So remember this. Without an impression, without something having been impressed upon you in some way, you can't have an idea about that thing, about that impression, because it didn't exist. So you must have an impression in order to have an idea. So, tracing ideas to their impressions. The idea is that ideas come from impressions. Let's look at the self. As we saw in the text and in the video lecture, there is no impression of the continuous self. There's no impression of this continuous self. Just perceptions. We are a bundle of collection of perceptions, always in flux and changing. So when you think of yourself, you really can't identify some one continuous thing that you can put your hands on and say, this is me. That cannot be done. Therefore, what Hume suggests is that we are a bundle or a collection of perceptions, always in flux and changing. So, for example, let's say you are a 20-year-old individual and I tell you or ask you to remember when you were 10 years old. And let's say you have the ability to do so. And I ask you, are you the same person you were then that you are now? Is that 10-year-old you the same person that you are today, the 20-year-old? You will say no. You'll hesitate to a degree because you know that you're the same person, but you're not the same person. You don't have the same collection of perceptions and ideas because the idea is very simple. We are a bundle, a collection of perceptions always in flux and always changing. Every time you meet someone new or do something, you have changed who you were from before. So the idea of continuous self, he's saying here, there's no impression for it. No impression of self, then the idea of self, according to Hume, is meaningless. Hume proposes a bundle theory of self, that there's no single self. The notion here is that there is a sort of a intuitiveness about that. Because again, when you think back to your 10-year-old self, you know there are some things which are probably somewhat the same, but a lot of things are different. Okay? Because you have a different bundle of perceptions and attitudes and things. And this is what we're sort of seeing or perceiving as our self-identity. So, in essence, what we think of as the continuous self doesn't exist. We're just a collection of things always changing. In fact, by the time you end listening to this particular lecture, you have been changed. Then the idea of causation, a big one. Causation, again, this is that one thing causes another. X causes Y, all right? So causation, unfortunately, according to Hume, goes beyond our perception. So, any argument whose conclusion goes beyond direct experience would have the following form. A has always been followed by B. Things we have not observed will resemble things we have, and therefore the next A will be followed by B. Wow, that is causation. But what he is suggesting here, and it makes sense, there's no reason that number 3 should work. The next A will be followed by B. How do we know? Okay, so what he's basically saying is that causation is sort of an argument that goes beyond what our direct experience says. So when we have causation, it relies upon the uniformity principle. Things we have not observed will resemble things we have. Per Hume, there is no rational justification for inductive reasoning, what we're saying here. Things we have not observed will resemble things we have until it doesn't. Okay, we saw a similar idea of this being presented earlier in earlier chapter 1 when we talked about Hume a little bit about the idea of we believe all swans are a certain color, and that was what the belief was. That was until it wasn't. Okay, until they saw another colored swan. So basically, the notion here is then this. We have causation. And why do we keep having this causation and believing that this is it? We rely upon the uniformity principle in order for this to keep going. So basically what he suggests, repeated exposure to A being followed by B makes us expect B upon presentation of the next A. Okay, we have been conditioned, and that's what it comes down to. Through experience, through repetition, through conditioning, we have our minds thinking causation. So every time we see A, we think B will follow. And again, I'm not talking about the alphabet here. I'm talking about I hit with a pool stick. I hit a pool ball. I hit the ball, and A ball will hit B, and it happens that way every single time until it doesn't. Okay, but with uniformity principle, we say we can predict, because of causation here, going beyond our direct experience, that if I hit A, B will be followed. So next we go into the period of Romanticism, and also some of the existentialist ideas. So let's look at the legacy of enlightenment that we see in chapter 7 with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. All right, the legacy of enlightenment. First of all, there was a backlash. The backlash was Romanticism. So Romanticism, this is the period in which we see some of these individuals living, and this was trying to go back to tradition of before the Enlightenment. So these individuals did not like what the Enlightenment had done by making us more scientific, by making us more city-focused, more future-focused. These individuals of Romanticism was now the pendulum swinging the other way. They wanted to get back to it. Get back to tradition, the way things were, more about nature over man as opposed to man over nature, going backwards as opposed to going future forward that we see there when it comes to the Enlightenment area. So Romanticism was a widespread movement influencing the visual arts, music, and so on. The father of the movement was Jean Rousseau, who had many ideas on a variety of topics. He's one of the individuals who thought feelings were more important than reason, and there are several videos that we're supposed to watch during this particular unit that talk about that very thing, is that oftentimes when we make a decision, we may rationalize why we reasoned it through and came up with this particular decision, but oftentimes we feel first, and the feeling is going to dictate what we want to decide, and then we come up with a rational reason for it later. So feelings over reasons. Humans are innately good in society, is what turns us bad, according to Jean Rousseau. Education should take advantage of our natural abilities. Again, as we see with many of these early philosophers that had some impact on psychology, they were not just focusing on the one aspect of mind and behavior. They're looking at the whole human being, looking at how we should be, looking at human nature, why we are the way we are. And then there's Johann Goethe, a very smart individual who's a polymath. He had many interests. He was an author of the best-selling novel Faust. He wrote on scientific matters such as evolution that influenced Darwin later. He talked about the inner conflicts of human life and death. As many, he influenced the work and ideas of Sigmund Freud, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. Now, let's talk about one of the first named individuals of this particular chapter, Arthur Schopenhauer. He's a general pessimist, as you will see as you read about his works, as well as look at some of the videos on him. He talked about things that are driving forces that motivate our behavior. One of them being a will to live or will to life, a driving force of basic motivation. Now, this is an ongoing search for fulfillment that this motivation drives us to that never will be achieved. So he sees these things of emotional, physical, and sexual desires that we just keep striving for these things, but they're never fully realized. Now, he also communicates the idea that we should sort of deny ourselves some of this stuff and we should live like a monk. He noted that we are very irrational creatures driven by our desires, and it can make us not think clearly, and we suffer because of others. Okay, particularly intelligent people suffer, therefore they seek solitude to be with their thoughts and avoid the less smart. He sees life as a postponement of death, and why we cling to life is because of that. We fear death. And again, we can see some of these ideas, and in the textbook it goes into more detail that he did indeed influence Freud. You can see where some of that may come from. So the notion here is that with this work, with his work, Schopenhauer did communicate some basic idea about drives, desires, and about irrationality, and about death and fear of it, influencing our behavior, that obviously does have some kinship to the works of Freud. So now let's talk a little bit about existentialism. The background. So as part of background, to give us an understanding of where we are with existentialists, which is about having some reason or purpose for your existence, the church's influence has been lessened. Remember, the Enlightenment, one of the impacts or effects of the Enlightenment was that people were a little bit less tied to the church, and the power of the church less, not just because of the Enlightenment, but through time and through scientific advancement and those types of things. The church's influence is not where it once was. The church normally provided direction and purpose for one's existence, because when the church was at its strength, when it comes to power over one's life, they dictated and told you what your purpose in life was. The rules of society was much stricter, much more categorized. People grew up to become whatever their father was or their mothers were. So we saw that type of thing. And so the church had a very significant role here. So the church normally provided direction. And so as the church lost its great and powerful influence, it also sort of had an impact on the purpose for one's existence. If they're not telling you or directing you, that being the church, and the world became more secular, not church-oriented or church-specific, then we are sort of lost. We don't understand where we are and where we fit in the world. So people are affected by the craziness of this world, how to cope, and are more alone without the guidance of the church. And that's what we see as this background. And so individuals had to come up with ways to try to help people understand what their purpose in life was. So existentialism stressed the meaning of human existence, freedom of choice, and the uniqueness of the individual. Soren Kierkegaard was seen as the first existentialist. He sought personal relationship with God without the church. Okay, here he states the idea that the truth is subjective and must be experienced, not taught. We see some of this basic types of ideas today in our particular very volatile environment, where people have their own subjective truth. So for them, the world is a certain way, and to a large extent, that becomes their truth. Truth is subjective. Okay, you can't teach it. But in some worlds, as we're saying today, the truth for one group may be different than a truth for another group. And sometimes, because when we believe in this truth, it can be very difficult for people to be convinced otherwise. You guys have taken enough psychology classes to know the underpinnings of some of those ideas. So, one of the things that Kierkegaard sort of communicated was the idea about stages that we can go through when it comes to personal freedom. And again, personal freedom is very much related to why it is that you exist, your purpose of existence, and those types of things. So it makes sense. The aesthetic stage, where we do not recognize their ability to choose anything. The second stage being the ethical stage, where we accept responsibility for choices, but influenced by principles established by others. And then the religious stage, where we accept their freedom and have a personal relationship with God. Nonconformist, similar to post-conventional stage of morality by Kohlberg, if you can recall that. So the notion here is that with existentialist Soren Kierkegaard, he's communicating, excuse me, they had a coughing fit. He's communicating the basic idea of where our personal freedoms may be in these particular stages. So here we accept the freedom and have personal relationship with God, and so we're more free to do what we need to. And then we look at Friedrich Nietzsche. He is the one that is usually associated with saying God is dead and we killed him. What he means by that is the notion of we stripped the church and religion to some extent of many of its tools to really relate to people, because secular views became more the common force of the day, and Earth is no longer the center of the universe. Human biology and animal biology are not that different, and this resulted in humans seeing themselves as not being so special anymore. So as the philosophy of science rose and grew, we saw that the secular views became more prominent, and these other things that were associated with it as well led to people not being so certain as to their place in the universe. So revisiting some of these ideas, I want to make sure that we cover them. So it results in us humans, we're not so special. We are more prone now to having fanaticism, some would say. We are also wishy-washy or easily influenced or led. So again, we can have also ideas being spread around, particularly in social media, and because we are not so rooted any longer, we are more easily led. That's what the basic ideas are here. So a problem of Western philosophy, intellect, passion, lifeless rationalism is what these things tend to lead to at times. So he sought a fusion. Nietzsche was seeking a fusion of the rational and irrational. So again, somewhat similar to what we saw with Schopenhauer, Nietzsche also was an individual that did influence Freud to a great extent, saying that we need not to try to push our irrational away, but to combine it, the rational and the irrational, so that we have a more passion for life that we are missing today. So Friedrich Nietzsche, he had the will to power. We saw the will to life or will to live for Schopenhauer. The will to power is that we want control over ourselves and our future. This he sees as the driving force. Now, he also identified this concept he referred to as the Übermensch or the Supermen, as individuals who could reach their full potential because they were not hindered by standard morality to govern their lives. So they went out there, went for it, grabbed it, and they would not necessarily be moral creatures in accomplishing it, but they were able to accomplish what they wanted to. They lived by a different code. The idea of the Superman was also used by the rise of the Nazi Party when they rose in Germany during just before World War II, and claimed that the people of Germany were indeed these Supermen, which gave them, from their perspective, some sort of legitimacy of being able to achieve what they wanted to, but not have to adhere to the standard morality of the day that people usually would have govern their lives. Okay, we'll end it there.